For decades, Vince McMahon seemed untouchable, especially when it came to the deaths of wrestlers under WWE's watch.
What, are you indicating that's my responsibility? These people are dead? Because
I'm asking you if it's in any way, shape, or form falls on your shoulders.
I would accept no responsibility whatsoever for their untimely deaths, none whatsoever.
However, as wrestlers died young from heart failure, overdoses, and suicide, he maintained one position: none of it was his fault. This is how McMahon addressed the deaths of wrestlers who worked for WWE. The question of responsibility. The title asks one question: what has Vince McMahon said about the wrestlers who died while working for WWE? The answer came in 2003 on HBO's Real Sports. Reporter Armin Katayan sat across from McMahon and asked about the over 60 wrestlers who had died, many under the age of 45, with 15 of them having worked for McMahon's organization. The question was direct: did any of this fall on McMahon's shoulders?
I would accept no responsibility whatsoever for their untimely deaths, none whatsoever. As far as, and you've got that little look on your face like, geez, Vince, how can you possibly say that?
Well, but none whatsoever. I mean, they wrestled for you. They were part of your organization. They worked a couple of hundred nights a year for you.
McMahon continued his defense by shifting the blame away from any single organization.
Why am I responsible for that? I gave them the opportunity.
Well, you ran it.
I ran one organization.
You controlled the biggest organization.
I don't think we were the biggest at that time, quite frankly. Okay, we're the sole surviving organization now. But as far as looking back on all of this, these individuals developed a lot of bad habits. That's not my responsibility.
This statement set the template for every public comment McMahon would make about wrestler deaths for the next 2 decades. The 2003 HBO interview became infamous for another reason. During the interview, McMahon slapped the reporter's notes out of his hands when pressed about the issue. The numbers behind the question were difficult to ignore. A 2003 study by the Journal of Forensic Sciences noted that wrestlers had a mortality rate 2.9 times higher than the general population, often linked to cardiovascular issues exacerbated by steroid use. Between 1985 and 2010, over 60 wrestlers associated with WWE died under age 50, including from heart attacks, overdoses, and accidents. McMahon took over WWF from his father in 1982 and expanded it into a global enterprise. The wrestlers who performed for him worked up to 300 days on the road per year. The schedule was punishing, the physical toll was constant, and when wrestlers died, McMahon maintained the same position.
What, are you indicating that's my responsibility? These people are dead? Because
I'm asking you if it's in any way, shape, or form falls on your shoulders.
I would accept no responsibility whatsoever for their untimely deaths, none whatsoever.
The pattern was established. McMahon would address the deaths. He would acknowledge the tragedy, and he would accept no responsibility. The HBO report documented the scope of the problem in detail. The program examined the lives and deaths of performers who had become household names during wrestling's boom periods. Names like Brian Pillman, who died of heart disease at 35. Names like Louis Spicolli, who died of an overdose. Names like Davey Boy Smith, the British Bulldog, who died of an apparent heart attack at 39. The families of these performers watched as the entertainment machine continued without pause. The reporter pressed McMahon on the culture that enabled this. The common elements across the deaths were difficult to ignore: cardiovascular issues, substance abuse, and the physical toll of performing hundreds of nights per year. Yet McMahon maintained his position. These were personal choices. These were bad habits. The company provided opportunities. What those performers did with their bodies outside the ring was their own business. This stance would be tested repeatedly in the years that followed, and each time, McMahon's response remained the same. The wrestling industry that McMahon dominated was unlike any other form of entertainment. Performers were expected to execute physically demanding moves night after night, often without adequate rest between shows. Unlike actors who performed the same stage play for months in one location, wrestlers traveled constantly, performing in different cities across the country. The toll this took on their bodies was immense. Joints wore down, spines compressed, concussions accumulated, and through it all, the expectation was clear: perform or be replaced. The independent contractor classification meant that when wrestlers were injured, they were on their own. No workers' compensation, no disability insurance, no company-funded rehabilitation. The men and women who built the WWE brand with their bodies had no safety net when those bodies gave out. Owen Hart and the show that went on. The death of Owen Hart on May 23, 1999, remains one of the most controversial moments in wrestling history. Hart, 34 years old, was preparing to descend from the rafters of the Kemper Arena in Kansas City during the Over the Edge pay-per-view event. The harness malfunctioned. He fell 78 feet and landed chest first on the ring ropes. He died from blunt force trauma. The audience in attendance did not see the fall clearly because the arena was in a planned blackout during the stunt. Blood pooled on the mat. Paramedics rushed to the ring. The wrestlers backstage learned their colleague was gone. McMahon made a decision that night that would define his approach to tragedy in professional wrestling. The show continued. In the 2024 Netflix docuseries Mr. McMahon, he addressed this decision directly. McMahon defended his choice with a statement that revealed his philosophy toward the business and the people in it. "Thank God for the audience, we were in a blackout. Had it been me who was splattered on the mat, I'd want the show to go on." He expanded on this reasoning further, claiming that stopping the event would have caused chaos, and asking what they would have told the audience if they had called off the show. The matches proceeded that evening, with wrestlers performing on a ring that still bore traces of their fallen colleague. Former wrestler New Jack spoke about Owen Hart's death in an interview and did not share McMahon's perspective.
I mean, okay, Owen Hart, when he died, okay, he died at a show in the ring. And Vince still had the show. The show went on, you know, and his wife sued him. I think she sued him, you know what I mean? But it was like every time something would happen with one of his wrestlers, he would brush it over like it didn't happen.
Hart's widow, Martha Hart, sued WWE following the incident. The case was settled for $18 million in 2000. McMahon never accepted responsibility for the accident, maintaining it was a tragic malfunction. The stunt that killed Owen Hart was part of a comedic gimmick. He was meant to descend from the arena rafters wearing a superhero-style costume, playing a parody character called the Blue Blazer. The harness system used was designed for rapid release, so Hart could unhook himself quickly upon landing. That design choice proved fatal when it released prematurely at the highest point of the descent. In a secret meeting with Owen's brother, Bret Hart, following the tragedy, McMahon wore a wire monitored by police due to threats that had been made. During that conversation, McMahon expressed regret over a previous controversy known as the Montreal Screwjob and offered Bret a return to WWE with a title run. Bret declined due to his WCW contract, but sought access to his video library for legacy preservation. He reportedly felt some closure after the 2-hour conversation. The wrestlers who performed that night at Over the Edge carried the memory of what happened with them. Some have spoken publicly about the confusion backstage, the disbelief that the show was continuing, and the pressure they felt to go out and perform while their colleague lay dead in the arena. The professional wrestling industry had always prided itself on the show must go on mentality. That night in Kansas City revealed what that mentality looked like when taken to its extreme. But the decision to continue the show that night in 1999 became a symbol of how McMahon approached death within his company. The product came first. The audience could not be disappointed. The show must go on. The Hart family's relationship with WWE was forever altered by that night. Martha Hart refused to allow WWE to induct Owen into their Hall of Fame, denying the company the ability to profit from his legacy. The settlement money could never compensate for the loss, and Martha dedicated herself to keeping Owen's memory alive on her own terms, outside of McMahon's control. For the wrestlers who performed that evening and in the weeks that followed, the message was clear. The company would honor them in death with tribute shows and video packages, but the machine would not stop. The schedule would not pause. The expectation to perform would not diminish. This was the reality of working for Vince McMahon's WWE. Chris Benoit and the denial of connection. On June 25, 2007, Vince McMahon stood before the cameras and announced the death of Chris Benoit.
However, in reality, WWE superstar Chris Benoit, his wife Nancy, and their son Daniel are dead. Their bodies were discovered this afternoon in their new suburban Atlanta home. The authorities are undergoing an investigation
What McMahon did not know at the time, what the entire wrestling industry did not yet understand, was the nature of those deaths. Chris Benoit had murdered his wife Nancy and their 7-year-old son Daniel before hanging himself. Investigations would later reveal severe brain damage in Benoit, equivalent to that of an 85-year-old Alzheimer's patient, linked to chronic traumatic encephalopathy, CTE, from repeated head trauma sustained during his career. That night, WWE aired a 3-hour tribute to Benoit before the full details emerged.
And you'll hear tonight comments from his peers, those here, his fellow performers, those here who loved Chris and admired him so much. So tonight will be a 3-hour tribute to one of the greatest WWE superstars of all time.
When the truth about the murder-suicide became public, McMahon's position shifted to defense. In the 2024 Netflix docuseries Mr. McMahon, he dismissed any connection between steroids, wrestling, or head injuries and Benoit's actions. His statement was absolute. There is no correlation between taking steroids and what happened to Chris Benoit. Chris went nuts. It happens in every form of life. Regarding the CTE findings, McMahon was equally dismissive. This doctor came up with this ridiculous statement, "That's a complete work. It looks like there's damage, and there's not. We know what we're doing. We don't hurt each other." In a 2007 CNN interview with his wife Linda, McMahon defended WWE against scrutiny. To put the WWE on the hot seat for someone who is a murderer is unfair. Nothing from the WWE had anything to do with Chris Benoit murdering his family. CM Punk, who was traveling with Benoit the week before the tragedy, spoke about processing the news.
And again, the biggest thing I can draw a comparison to is when Chris Benoit did a murder-suicide, right? I was friends with Chris Benoit, and I don't know if it's just how I process things, but I'm famously like on camera weeping, you know, saying goodbye to Chris, because at the time we didn't know, right? We didn't know he had, you know, murdered his wife and his son.
The Benoit tragedy forced WWE to cancel a storyline in which McMahon had faked his own death in a limousine explosion. The incident led to policy changes, including the expansion of the wellness policy and the eventual banning of unprotected chair shots to the head. But McMahon maintained that the company bore no responsibility for what happened to Chris Benoit or his family. The science on chronic traumatic encephalopathy continued to evolve in the years following Benoit's death. Research established clear connections between repeated head trauma and degenerative brain disease. Football players, boxers, and other contact sport athletes were diagnosed with CTE at alarming rates. The wrestling industry, with its scripted but physically brutal matches, became part of this conversation. McMahon's dismissal of CTE findings stood in contrast to the medical evidence presented after Benoit's autopsy. Dr. Julian Bales, who examined Benoit's brain, found damage consistent with someone who had sustained thousands of head impacts over a career that spanned decades. The diving headbutt that became Benoit's signature move, performed from the top rope onto opponents lying in the ring, subjected his brain to repeated trauma with every execution. New Jack, who knew Benoit's wife Nancy personally, rejected the idea that CTE or steroids explained what happened.
He never got hit in the head. I'll show you tapes of Benoit putting his hand up in the way, taking a chair shot. You know what I mean? He never got hit in the head. So that was maybe steroids, but it wasn't no that you just mentioned. It wasn't that.
The debate over what caused Benoit to kill his family and himself continued for years. Medical experts pointed to the brain damage. Former colleagues pointed to the intense pressure of the business. Some, like New Jack, dismissed the CTE explanation entirely. But regardless of the cause, McMahon's position remained unchanged. The company bore no responsibility. The Benoit case became a reference point for discussions about brain injuries in contact sports. When the NFL faced its own reckoning over CTE and former players, the wrestling industry's experience with Benoit provided a grim preview of what unchecked head trauma could produce. The scientific evidence mounted, but McMahon continued to dismiss it as exaggerated or fabricated. The culture that bred the crisis. The wrestlers who died were not isolated cases. They were products of an environment that had been cultivated over decades under McMahon's leadership. The steroid era of the 1980s and 1990s created physiques that defined professional wrestling, but destroyed the bodies of those who achieved them. Painkillers became a necessity for performers working through injuries night after night. The schedule never stopped. McMahon acknowledged this history in the 2003 HBO interview, but framed it as a bygone era.
It was more of a Wild West show back in the 80s, no doubt about that. And I think that, in terms of illegal drug usage, in terms of cocaine, there was quite a bit of that went on. Again, I don't throw any stones. I was a part of that whole scene myself.
The company's drug testing policy had a troubled history. Testing was implemented from 1992 to 1996, but was discontinued because WWE claimed it was cost prohibitive. When the policy was later reintroduced, McMahon defended its effectiveness by noting the absence of visible signs. Well, there are no syringes left anywhere. There's no vials left anywhere. I don't see any roid rage. But others who worked in the industry saw a different picture. Former wrestler Maven Huffman publicly admitted that everyone in the locker room took steroids, including himself, and described the pressure from the company to enhance appearances. Kurt Angle, an Olympic gold medalist, admitted to taking up to 65 Vicodin a day during his WWE tenure, blaming the schedule and the work hurt mentality. Roddy Piper, one of the most recognizable names in wrestling history, spoke about the lack of an exit plan for wrestlers in the same HBO report.
Wrestling has a tremendous entrance plan. You come in as, boy, here you are, you rock and roll and everything is wonderful. It's got no exit plan.
And Rowdy Roddy Piper should know. A few months ago, he climbed back into the ring.
What would you have me do at 49 when my pension plan I can't take out till I'm 65? I'm not going to make 65. Let's just face facts, guys.
The independent contractor classification that WWE imposed on its performers denied them health insurance, paid time off, and workers' compensation despite the company controlling their schedules, appearances, and even their in-ring styles. A 2019 academic paper analyzed this practice, noting that WWE's travel schedule exceeded that of major sports leagues like the NHL, NBA, NFL, and MLB, with no off-season. A former WWE writer described the environment under McMahon in stark terms.
These are severely damaged people who had really horrible childhoods, who just roll over people. Like, they just basically, their whole part of existence is to put their thumb on people, to shit on people. And I don't know how else to put it, but that stuff, and I've seen it with really these billionaires, and it's awful behavior, and it's horrible to see, and you can see why they're successful, because they bully people, and they run things with fear, and it's...
The writer continued to describe specific practices that illustrated the environment.
Vince had this thing where he'd have meetings with the head writers and a writing assistant, like at Friday. He'd call the meeting like at 5 p.m. But then he wouldn't take the meeting until 10 p.m. So he'd make them sit outside his office, and they haven't eaten. And then he would, call them in like 9 or 10 at night.
Ken Shamrock, a former WWE performer, offered a different perspective when discussing the hush money scandal that led to McMahon's resignation.
It hasn't been a secret. I mean, there's always been allegations, and I don't think anybody really truly believes they weren't true. I think they just believe that we know now, they were just paid off for, hush money. So this is no shock. I mean, we live in this world, and it happens all the time.
But when asked about New Jack's comment that McMahon had blood on his hands, Shamrock pushed back.
That's wrong. Why is Vince responsible? What? Since when do people not take responsibility for their own actions? How do you blame somebody for what you're doing to yourself? That doesn't make sense to me. I mean, Vince is no angel, man. I don't, I mean, obviously I know, and I'm not best friends with him, right? But he's never treated me wrong, and that's just the way it is.
The debate over responsibility remained unresolved, shaped by individual experiences within the company. The 1994 federal steroid trial had nearly ended McMahon's career before this era of deaths became a national story. McMahon was indicted on federal charges of conspiring to distribute anabolic steroids, possessing them with intent to distribute, and embezzling funds from Titan Sports to purchase the drugs. The 18-day trial ended in acquittal, but the evidence presented exposed the culture that existed within the locker room. McMahon transferred company ownership to his wife, Linda, before the trial as a precaution. The trial established that steroids were readily available within the company during the 1980s. Wrestlers testified about picking up packages at company headquarters. The ringside doctor, George Zahorian, had already been convicted for distributing steroids to 37 wrestlers wrestlers and 6 officials. The company's aesthetic demands, the expectation of enormous muscular physiques that define the wrestling product, created pressure that performers felt regardless of whether explicit orders were given. Rowdy Roddy Piper's testimony about the lack of an exit plan reflected a deeper structural problem. Wrestlers were classified as independent contractors, not employees. This classification meant no health insurance, no retirement benefits, no workers' compensation, and no union protection. When their bodies broke down from the constant travel and physical punishment, they had few options. Many returned to the ring long after their bodies told them to stop because they had no other way to earn a living. The HBO report featured commentary from both sides of the debate. The question of personal responsibility versus corporate accountability was never fully resolved in these discussions. Wrestlers made choices about what they put in their bodies. They chose to perform through injuries. They chose to pursue careers in an industry known for its physical demands. But critics argued that these choices were made within a system designed by McMahon, a system that rewarded certain physiques, demanded constant performance, and provided no safety net for those who broke down. The deaths continued throughout the 2000s. Each one prompted a brief moment of reflection within the industry, followed by a return to business as usual. Tribute shows were held, moments of silence were observed, and the schedule continued, as relentless as ever. The aftermath and the legacy. The lawsuits came. Over 60 former wrestlers, including names like Jimmy Superfly Snuka and Road Warrior Animal, sued WWE and McMahon personally, alleging the company knew about the risks of repeated head trauma, but failed to warn or protect performers. The suits claimed WWE scripted dangerous moves while downplaying concussion dangers, leading to CTE and other neurological issues. A federal appeals court dismissed the case in 2020, ruling it time-barred under Connecticut law. The U.S. Supreme Court declined to hear it in 2021. WWE called the suits frivolous and emphasized their post-2006 reforms. The legal defeats did not diminish the voices of those who believed McMahon bore responsibility. The plaintiffs in those lawsuits had devoted their bodies to the wrestling business. They had performed through concussions, worked schedules that professional athletes in other sports would never accept, and watched their colleagues die at rates that defied actuarial tables. The statute of limitations may have run out, but their experiences had not changed. Linda McMahon's Senate campaigns in 2010 and 2012 brought renewed scrutiny to the company's history. Political opponents cited the deaths of over 60 wrestlers under age 50 since the 1980s as evidence of negligence under the McMahon's leadership. Former U.S. Representative Henry Waxman had investigated WWE's steroid policies in 2007, and those questions resurfaced during the campaigns. Linda McMahon lost both races, though she would later serve in government positions during the Trump administration. The 2024 Netflix docuseries Mr. McMahon brought renewed attention to his statements on wrestler deaths. McMahon appeared throughout the 6-episode series, filmed primarily before his 2022 resignation amid sexual misconduct allegations. Before the release, McMahon issued a statement on X, formerly Twitter, calling the series misleading and deceptive, claiming it conflated his on-screen persona with his real self. His comments on wrestler deaths in the docuseries followed the pattern established decades earlier. On the decision to continue the show after Owen Hart's death, he stood firm. On Chris Benoit and CTE, he dismissed the science. On his overall responsibility for the environment he created, he offered a broader philosophy. I don't really regret anything in my life. He extended this to his views on people who stopped contributing. When you stop growing, you die. I have no sympathy for people like that. So go die. CM Punk was asked in 2024 whether the business was better off without McMahon.
Did you know, let's be honest, Vince McMahon wasn't an angel. Everyone knew that he wasn't an angel. But this is like next level. This is evil, right? Like this is next level stuff. Yeah. If what is being alleged is true, right? Did you have any idea that this type of behavior was going on behind the scenes?
New Jack had made his assessment years earlier. The assessment was harsh, but it reflected a sentiment shared by many who watched friends and colleagues die young in an industry that celebrated them in life and moved on quickly after their deaths. The tributes aired, the moments of silence observed, and then the show continued. Always the show continued. Since McMahon's departure, WWE under Paul Triple H Levesque has reportedly improved conditions for performers. House shows have been reduced significantly, allowing for more recovery time and family life. Former wrestlers wrestlers like Randy Orton have praised these changes, noting they prevent burnout. Staff at WWE headquarters have reported enjoying a healthier work-life balance since McMahon's exit. The list of wrestlers who died young during and after McMahon's tenure includes names recognized by millions. Andre the Giant at 46, British Bulldog at 39, Eddie Guerrero at 38, Brian Pillman at 35, Owen Hart at 34, Chris Benoit at 40. The causes varied: heart failure, overdoses, accidents, suicide, but they shared common threads: the demands of the schedule, the pressure to maintain impossible physiques, the lack of health benefits, and the culture that told them to keep performing through pain. The numbers tell a story that McMahon never acknowledged. At least 23 wrestlers around the world died in a 3-year period in the early 2000s alone. The reporter who covered this issue for HBO noted that while WWE implemented testing in response to public pressure, the underlying conditions that drove wrestlers toward drugs, the schedule, the injuries, the lack of health care, remained largely intact. McMahon built professional wrestling into a global entertainment empire. He transformed a regional carnival attraction into a billion-dollar publicly traded company. He created characters and storylines that generations of fans remember. He also presided over an industry where former wrestlers are 123 times more likely to die from drug overdoses than the general population. The wellness policy introduced after Eddie Guerrero's death in 2005 and strengthened after the Benoit tragedy did reduce some visible problems. Fewer performers showed obvious signs of steroid abuse. Drug testing became routine, suspensions were handed out, but critics argued these changes came decades too late for the performers who had already destroyed their bodies under McMahon's watch. The policy was reactive, not proactive. It came after the deaths, after the scandals, after the congressional inquiries. For the wrestlers who died in the 1980s, 1990s, and early 2000s, no wellness policy could help them. They had already paid the price for working in an industry that demanded everything from their bodies while offering little protection in return. When asked about this, his answer never changed.
That question, I mean, why are you indicating that's my responsibility? These people are dead because...
I'm asking you if it's in any way, shape, or form falls on your shoulders.
I would accept no responsibility whatsoever for their untimely deaths, none whatsoever.
That was how Vince McMahon finally opened up about the wrestlers who died working for WWE. Thank you for watching. If you enjoyed watching this video, click on one of the boxes playing on your screen to watch more similar content.